She had one rule she gave herself the night she first saw him standing in that auction room. Back straight, jaw sharp, a tattoo climbing his neck like a signature written in a language only dangerous men speak. Do not let him in. She kept that rule for exactly 37 days. Then she was standing in his penthouse, marble walls, soft gold light, the kind of silence that only exists in rooms where important decisions get made. And Kang Tai-os was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided to keep. And when her breath caught, when her voice came out smaller than Amara Vance had ever allowed it to, like her own body had betrayed everything her name stood for, he didn't smirk. He didn't step back. He leaned in, lowered his voice to something that felt like a promise wrapped in a warning, and said, "I'll be gentle." The dangerous part was never him. The dangerous part was that she believed him. This is their story. And if this story already has you locked in, hit that follow button right now because you do not want to miss where this goes. Let's get into it. Amara Vance was not supposed to notice him. She was there for a client, a property developer named Choi who had more wall space than taste and had hired her to fix that problem one carefully chosen piece at a time. The rooftop auction was her third work event that week. She had a list, a budget, and exactly zero interest in anything that wasn't on either one. She was there to work. She was going to work. And then she looked up. He was standing near the far edge of the rooftop, away from the crowd the way a man stands when he is used to having space without asking for it. Back straight, hands in his pockets, not browsing, not bidding, not performing interest the way everyone else in the room was. Just watching. The city stretched out behind him like it was providing a backdrop specifically for him, and he hadn't noticed and wouldn't have cared if he had. She noticed the tattoo before anything else. Dark ink climbing his neck, not decorative, not fashionable. It looked like something earned, something permanent in a way that had nothing to do with the needle that put it there. She looked away, went back to her list, found piece number 3 on her client's wish list and raised her paddle cleanly at the right moment. His paddle went up a beat after hers. She turned. He was already looking at her, not with amusement, not with challenge, just looking, like he had been waiting to see what she would do next. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds longer than was comfortable and raised her paddle again. His went up without hesitation. The number climbed. She let it go. It was already past her client's budget, and she was not about to spend someone else's money on a staring contest. She moved on, found her remaining pieces, did her job, and at no point, not once, did she cross the rooftop to find out who he was. She told herself that was a choice. Later, sitting at her desk with her laptop open in the city dark outside her studio window, she typed the one thing she had managed to catch across the room. A name someone had used near him in passing. Not to him, near him. The way people say a name when they want someone important to know they know it. Kang. She searched it, then searched it again with every combination she could think of. LinkedIn, news archives, public records. Nothing. No face. No profile. No history. No digital footprint of any kind. Like he existed only in rooms he chose to enter. She closed the laptop, sat in the quiet for a long moment. Then she made herself a cup of tea she didn't drink and went to bed thinking about a man whose name wasn't even a full name. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. She saw him 3 days later. Her usual coffee shop. Corner table by the window. The one she never sat at because it faced the street and she preferred walls to windows when she was working. He was at the counter when she walked in, not waiting for anything, not looking at anything in particular, just standing there the way he had stood at the auction. Like arriving was enough and the rest was details. He didn't look at her. She ordered her coffee, took her usual seat, opened her laptop and told herself it was a coincidence. It happened again 4 days after that. Her fabric supplier on the north side, a narrow shop sandwich between a dry cleaner and a restaurant that was always too loud. She was there for linen samples for a client's study renovation. She turned from the display rack, and he was 2 rows away, his back to her, looking at nothing she could identify as a reason to be there. She left without the samples. The third time she was walking into a client's building downtown, a glass tower she had worked in twice before, and the elevator doors were closing when a hand came through them. Unhurried. Certain. The doors opened again and Kang Taoe stepped in, pressed a floor she didn't catch, and stood beside her in silence for 11 floors without looking at her once. She stared straight ahead. Her jaw was tight the entire ride. When the doors opened at her floor, she stepped out and didn't look back and spent the next 4 hours measuring rooms with hands that were not entirely steady. The fourth time she was done being quiet about it. The parking garage beneath her studio building. Late afternoon, the light coming in gray and flat through the entrance. She heard his footsteps behind her. She recognized them now, which was its own kind of problem, and she stopped walking, turned around, and looked at him directly with every ounce of the steadiness her name was supposed to mean. Why do you keep showing up? He stopped, looked at her the way he always looked at her, like she was something worth taking time with. No apology in it. No performance. Just attention, because you keep being somewhere worth going. She stood very still for a moment. That was not the answer she had prepared for. She had prepared for denial, a deflection, something she could push back against cleanly. Not that. Not something that landed in her chest the way that did and refused to move. She walked to her car without another word, but she didn't report him. And she knew, somewhere she wasn't ready to name yet, that she wasn't going to. It had been raining since noon, and Amara had been ignoring it since 2. She finally left the studio at 8:30, later than she meant to, her bag over one shoulder and a tube of rolled blueprints under her arm that made navigating the door more complicated than it needed to be. The street was wet and quiet, the kind of quiet that only happens when rain has been falling long enough to clear everyone sensible indoors. She made it 4 steps before she felt the rain stop hitting her. Not because it had stopped falling. She looked up. An umbrella, black, held over her with the kind of steadiness that said it had been waiting there before she even came through the door. She followed the arm holding it up and found Kang Taoe standing beside her, his shirt darkening at the shoulder where the rain caught the edge, he left uncovered to keep her dry. She looked at his shoulder, then at him. You're getting wet. I know. She didn't move. He didn't move. The rain came down between them and around them, and he just stood there like getting soaked was a perfectly reasonable thing to do on a Wednesday evening. Your name, she said. Your full name. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes, not hesitation exactly, more like a decision being made in real time. Kang Taoe. She turned it over in her mind, searched it the way she had searched Kang alone, and found the same thing. Nothing. No recognition, no alarm bells from any corner of her memory. The relief on his face was small and quick, and he didn't try to hide it. That was what stayed with her. Not that he was relieved, but that he let her see it. What do you do? She asked. I manage outcomes. That's not an answer. It's the most honest one I have right now. She studied him. The rain tapped steadily against the umbrella above her. Somewhere down the street, a car moved through a puddle, and the sound of it filled the silence for a moment before fading. You're not afraid of me, he said. Not a question. Something closer to wonder than observation. She looked at him, really looked, at the ink climbing his neck, at the steadiness of a man who had been standing in the rain for who knew how long just to hold an umbrella over a woman who hadn't asked him to. Should I be? He held her gaze. Yes. She stood in the dry space he was making for her and felt the word land somewhere deep and quiet inside her chest. She didn't run. She wasn't sure what that said about her, but she stood there in the rain that wasn't touching her and decided that tonight, at least, she didn't need to know. The invitation came on a card. No envelope, no postage, no explanation of how it arrived on her studio desk between the hours of 7 and 9 on a Tuesday morning when she was the only one with a key. One line, an address, a time, and at the bottom, in handwriting that was precise without being careful, come. T. She told herself she wasn't going. She told her best friend Adiz she wasn't going. She spent 40 minutes standing in front of a wardrobe telling herself she wasn't going and then put on her deep burgundy wrap dress. Professional, deliberate, the choice of a woman who knew she was walking into a room that would be watching her, and went. The building had no signage. 12th floor. A private dining room that felt like it had been designed for conversations that would never appear in any record. 12 people around a long table, low lighting, no menus. The food simply arrived, which told her everything she needed to know about how often these particular people ate in rooms like this. TOS was at the head of the table. He stood when she entered. Nobody else did, but nobody missed it either. He pulled her chair out himself, which she noted because she watched him the rest of the evening, and he did it for no one else. The people around the table were polished in the way that money makes people polished. Smooth surfaces, careful eyes, conversation that meant three things at once. They asked her about her work with the particular interest of people who are not actually interested in your work. She answered clearly and without performance and felt their attention recalibrate around her in real time. She was being measured. She understood that without needing anyone to confirm it. Then the man to her left, silver-haired, the kind of comfortable that comes from decades of being the most important person in rooms, made a comment about interior decorating. The word he used was decorative. The tone he used it in was not about furniture. She didn't get the chance to respond. TOS didn't raise his voice, didn't move. He simply turned his eyes to the man and held them there in a silence that had weight and temperature and history behind it. The table went still. The silver-haired man cleared his throat and turned to Imara directly. My apologies. Your work is remarkable. Nobody explained why. Nobody needed to. On the drive back, she sat beside TOS in the quiet of the car and watched the city move past the window. You didn't say a word all evening, she said. He kept his eyes on the road. I was memoizing you. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the window and said nothing and felt something shift in her chest that she was not yet ready to name out loud. She had noticed a shift on the drive home, but hadn't named it. The way he held the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary. The way he looked at her once at a red light and then looked away like he had made a decision he hadn't fully made peace with yet. When they got to the penthouse, he didn't offer her a drink. Didn't make small talk. He sat down across from her, rested his arms on his knees, and looked at her the way a man looks when he is about to say something he cannot take back. And then he told her everything. Not dramatically, not with apology or theater, or any of the softening she might have expected from someone delivering news this size. He spoke the way she imagined he made decisions, cleanly, directly, without leaving room for misunderstanding. The Kang Syndicate, what it controlled, what it moved, the operations running through Chicago and Seoul that kept certain people powerful and certain problems quiet. The decisions he had made in rooms she would never see about people whose names she would never know. He didn't dress it up. He didn't ask her to understand it. He just laid it out in front of her like a set of blueprints and let her look. When he finished speaking, the room was very quiet. He stood, walked to the door of the penthouse and opened it. Said nothing, just left it open and came back and stood near the window and waited. Imara sat with everything he had just handed her. The weight of it, the shape of it, the way it reframed every encounter, the auction, the coffee shop, the rain, the dinner table, all of it, into something larger and more permanent than she had allowed herself to consider. She looked at the open door. Then she looked at him. Then she sat back in her chair. His expression shifted, barely, just a fractional movement around his eyes, but she caught it. He had expected her to leave, had prepared himself for it, had probably rehearsed a version of himself that would watch her go without showing what it cost him. I'm not staying because I'm not scared, she said quietly. I'm staying because I'm terrified, and I'm choosing you anyway. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and sat beside her, and they stayed like that, not touching, just present, in the silence of a decision that had changed everything. She had chosen, and somewhere in the stillness of that room, so had he. Okay, wait. If you're watching this right now and your heart is racing, drop a fire in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. because this story is about to shift into something nobody is ready for. Keep watching. The message came through TiOS's security team on a Thursday morning. 3 words in a report that was otherwise full of language designed to make dangerous things sound administrative. She is being watched. He told her that evening. Not gently, not harshly, directly. The way she had come to understand was simply how he moved through difficult things. Baek Junhyun's faction had been tracking her movements for weeks. Her coffee shop, her studio, the route she walked home on Tuesdays when the weather was good enough. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked one question. What do we do? Not what does he do? Not what should she do? He moved her into the penthouse that weekend. She brought 2 bags, her drafting kit, and a small framed photograph of her mother that lived on every desk she had ever worked at. She set it on the kitchen counter and TiOS looked at it once and never moved it. The training started Monday. Not weapons. He was clear about that from the beginning and she didn't argue. What he taught her instead was something quieter and in many ways more useful. How to read a room the moment she entered it. Where the exits were before she needed them. How to identify when someone's attention had shifted from casual to deliberate. How to trust the part of her instincts that sounded an alarm before her conscious mind had caught up enough to explain why. The sessions were early. Disciplined. He was patient in the way that people are patient when the stakes are too high for impatience. He corrected her without condescension and pushed her without pressure, and she found herself improving faster than she expected, which he suspected said less about her and more about the quality of his attention. 3 weeks in, on a Friday morning, they were running a situational drill in the penthouse gym. She was practicing reading his body language for tells, learning the difference between how he moved when he was relaxed and how he moved when something had changed in a room. She called it correctly 4 times in a row. On the 5th, he moved differently and she caught it and said so, and he stopped. They were close. The kind of close that had been building in the margins of every session for 3 weeks and had simply, finally, run out of room. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back. She reached out and stopped him with one hand on his arm. Not urgently, not dramatically, just certain. He looked at her hand, then at her face, and the decision that moved across his expression was the quietest and most complete thing she had ever watched a person choose. She was reviewing fabric samples for a client project when she saw it. A news alert. The kind that arrives without warning and sits on your screen for just long enough to change something. She almost scrolled past it. She had been avoiding the news lately, a quiet self-protective habit she had developed without consciously deciding to. But the word stopped her before she could look away. Kang. She put the fabric samples down. The report was brief and breaking. The kind of coverage that arrives before journalists have all the facts and fills the gaps with careful language. A coordinated federal raid on a Chicago-based operation with alleged ties to an international syndicate. 1 arrest. The name released was Kang. There was footage. A man being walked from a building in the gray early morning light, head down, hands behind his back. Imara stopped breathing. Then the camera caught his face. He was young. Late 20s at most. The bone structure was similar, the same jaw, the same stillness even in that moment. But it wasn't TiOS. She exhaled so hard she had to sit down. Her hands were not steady and she did not pretend they were. His name was Seo-jun. She learned that from the 2nd alert, then the 3rd. TiOS's cousin. The report described him as a mid-level figure in the organization. The language was careful and the charges were serious, and the coverage moved on to other things by noon the way news always does. TiOS came home at 10 that night. She heard the door, heard him set his keys down, heard the particular silence that followed, the kind that has weight in it, that presses against the walls of a room before any words arrive to fill it. She found him in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a glass of water in front of him that he hadn't touched. His coat was still on. His eyes were on the middle distance the way eyes get when they are looking at something that isn't in the room. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer the kind of comfort that arrives in words and lands like noise. She simply pulled out the stool beside him and sat down and let the quiet be what it was. A long time passed. Then, into the stillness, without looking up. He chose it. A pause that had the whole weight of it in there somewhere. That doesn't make it lighter. She didn't tell him it was okay. It wasn't okay, and they both knew that, and he didn't need her to pretend otherwise. She just stayed. Sometimes that is the only thing that means anything. The message arrived through official syndicate channels on a Monday morning, which told her more than the message itself did. Baek Junhyun had done this deliberately, formally, on record, through the proper structures of a world that had its own version of protocol. He wanted TOS to know that this was not a threat made in the heat of a moment. It was a decision. Step down from the Chicago operation or the woman pays the price. Those were not the exact words used. The language was more administrative than that, the way all truly dangerous things tend to dress themselves in careful phrasing. But that was the shape of it stripped bare. TOS didn't tell her. That was the first thing she noticed. He was quieter than usual that evening, which he had learned to read the way she read rooms, not by what was present, but by what was missing. The particular quality of his attention was different, turned inward, working through something he had already decided she wouldn't be part of. She let it go that night. The next morning, she went to his private office to return a book she had borrowed from his shelf and found the desk covered in documents. She almost left them alone. Then she saw her name, a new identity, complete and carefully assembled, a name she didn't recognize, a social security number, a rental agreement for an apartment in a city she had never been to, a bank account with a number that made her breath catch, a letter in his handwriting that he had started 4 times and crossed out 3 of them. She read every page. Then she walked to where he was standing by the kitchen counter and set the documents down in front of him and held his gaze while she tore them in half. Cleanly, deliberately, the way her name was supposed to mean. He watched her without speaking. She walked to the front door and stood in front of it with her arms at her sides and her voice steady in a way that cost her something to maintain. "You're not sending me away to protect me." Her voice was quiet, but it had no give in it. "You're sending me away because it's easier to lose me on your terms than theirs. I'm not a liability, Ty. I'm the only thing you have that's real." He stood very still. "Don't you dare throw that away because you're afraid." The silence that followed was long and full, and neither of them moved inside it. He didn't touch the door. She knew what that meant. She had learned to read in the way he had taught her to read rooms, by what wasn't moving. Neither of them was moving. That was its own kind of answer. He didn't sleep much in those 90 days. She knew because she was there for most of them. The war TOS waged looked nothing like what that word usually means. There were no confrontations she was aware of, no raised voices, no visible machinery of conflict moving through the penthouse. What there was instead was work, quiet, precise, and relentless. Calls taken in the early hours, documents reviewed and signed and sent. Meetings she was not part of that lasted long enough to tell her they mattered. She gave him the space for it without being asked, kept her own schedule, her own clients, her own work spread across the dining table in a way that made the penthouse feel lived in rather than occupied. She cooked on Thursdays. He cleaned up without being asked. Small things. The kind that builds something real so gradually you only notice it when you try to imagine the alternative. Beck's faction did not collapse dramatically. That was not how TOS worked, and she understood that now. It eroded, piece by piece, leverage by leverage, exposure by careful exposure. The foundation of Beck's influence was quietly and systematically removed until the structure above it had nothing left to stand on. The final move took 3 weeks to arrange and 40 minutes to execute. She didn't know the details. He didn't offer them, and she didn't ask for them because she had learned that some things he carried alone not to shut her out, but because putting them into words would make them heavier, and they were already heavy enough. What she knew was this: he surrendered the Chicago operation, his father's seat, the territory the Kang name had been built on in this city, the foundation of everything he had been raised to inherit and protect and eventually pass on. He gave it to a neutral party in exchange for a formal withdrawal of all action against her. Permanent. Documented. Binding in the only way that world understood binding. He came home on a Tuesday evening in early spring. She heard the door, heard his keys. Then nothing, none of the usual sounds of a man moving through a space that belongs to him. She came out of the study and found him standing at the kitchen counter, his coat still on, a single key on the counter in front of him, separate from his own. He looked at her. I gave up his empire. A pause that held everything the 90 days had cost him. Not mine. Another pause. Quieter. Not ours. She looked at the key for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and picked it up. And for the first time in 37 days, she felt the rule she had made herself, the one she had broken and rebuilt and broken again, dissolve completely and without regret. The dangerous part was never him. It never was. And that is why KangTaiOS is built different. He didn't just choose her. He dismantled an empire to keep his word. If this story hit different for you, follow for more and drop a comment with your favorite moment. I read every single one. See you in the next one.